Hello, my name is Karen Lee, and I am the DDA Public Policy Fellow for Employment First. I'm joined today by Ken Capone, who is the Public Policy Director for People on the Go Maryland, as well as an employee at the Maryland Center for Developmental Disabilities. Both Ken and I are board members of the Maryland Untitled Chapter as well. We're going to talk today a little bit about the work that has been done in Maryland to increase opportunities for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to work in competitive integrated employment.
For many years, people with disabilities have fought for equality and full integration into society. While our nation has made important strides in fighting disability discrimination, there are still people with disabilities who still struggle to have access to meaningful employment. You may ask, what constitutes as meaningful employment? My answer is that meaningful employment must provide a living wage, where a person with a disability has the ability to obtain the same things as someone without a disability.
What do you mean by the same things, Ken?
This can range from the ability to buy a sandwich to those much larger life decisions like buying a house or a vehicle. I can tell you through personal experience that my life has been enriched through having a job which provides me the ability to have my own house, my own vehicle, and much more.
So Maryland is really a shining example of a state that has done the two steps necessary to increase competitive integrated employment for people with disabilities. And that is to change the system at the same time as building the capacity. And that was done through the Maryland State Strategic Plan for Employment First, but also the legislation that you worked very hard on. And the visioning and stakeholder engagement has created a real opportunity here in Maryland.
Through the Employment First policy and strategic plan, the state of Maryland has joined with other states across the country to say firmly that we believe employment should be the first and preferred option for people with disabilities, regardless of the severity of the disability. There's much work that remains to be done in this area. The fact is, people with disabilities make up the largest minority group in the country. We also have the highest rates of unemployment and underemployment. Being an employment-first state, Maryland is beginning to see the dawn of a new day, where people with disabilities will work alongside their non-disabled peers, and through the wages they earn, they will have the opportunity to purchase homes, vehicles, or something as simple as buying a piece of candy.
I'm going to speak a little bit about the journey of Maryland's Developmental Disabilities Administration to our strategic plan for increasing competitive integrated employment, our Employment First strategic plan. In June of 2015, we gathered a large group of people, 150 people, to talk about where Maryland was with competitive integrated employment. And the result of that was a gathering of about 8 groups around the state to talk about various subjects like finance, capacity building, training, technical assistance, important parts of making change to the state. And we gathered throughout the course of the year, and at the end of the year, we brought back together each of the group's goals, outcomes, and strategic moves, and created a state strategic plan for implementing Employment First. At the same time, we developed a state leadership team to take a look at the plan and to make sure the plan continues to move forward. All of these activities together have helped Maryland to begin looking at building capacity for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to become competitively employed. Concurrent to the capacity building work that we were doing with Employment First strategic plan, a group of advocates started to meet to talk about how do we get rid of 14C and the use of sub-minimum wage certificates so that folks can work competitively in the community. And Ken, if you would like to talk a little bit about the Equal Employment Act, I'd appreciate that.
The Equal Employment Act is legislation that will phase out the use of special wage certificates in the state of Maryland over the next 4 years, so providers of service are not allowed to pay people with disabilities less than the applicable state or local minimum wage.
Ken, what was the catalyst or the vision behind starting this legislation?
The proposed legislation had been in the making for a while. Advocates such as National Federation of the Blind, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and People on the Go started talking about sheltered workshops / sub-minimum wage and the idea of legislation in 2014. We looked at the Time Act bill, which is a federal bill that directs the Secretary of Labor to discontinue issuing new certificates to businesses or governmental entities, special wage certificates, which permit individuals with disabilities, including individuals employed in agriculture, to be paid at lower than minimum wages. We started researching other states to see where the trend in policy was going. We have always believed that paying people sub-minimum wage is a violation of civil rights.
Ken, can you share a little bit about how the group of advocates came together and it turned from just a dialogue into an actual bill?
By the time 2015 rolled around, the initial 3 advocacy organizations really believed that legislation was possible for Maryland's 2016 legislative session. We expanded our little group to a coalition that included MD Chapter of APS, ARC Maryland, Developmental Disabilities Council, Maryland Association of Community Services, Maryland Disability Law Center, Maryland Works, Inc., and others. The coalition brought different perspectives and new ideas for legislation.
People are really interested around the country about how this came to be. A lot of folks are wanting something to replicate the work that you have done in their own state. Can you talk a little bit about the real process that it takes to go from an idea to a bill?
We embarked upon the task of campaigning within the General Assembly itself. Our sponsors within the Assembly were Senator Dolores Kelly, a longtime champion for disability rights issues with a special interest in this bill due to the fact that I had interned with the Senator's office some years ago. So the Senator knew our work well and was interested in sponsoring the bill.
Wonderful. Was anybody else involved in the legislative process?
Delegate Jeff Waldstreicher was a relatively new presence within the Assembly. He was interested in this issue from a standpoint of civil rights. Thanks to the contributions of Senator Kelly and Delegate Waldstreicher, our coalition was able to move forward with an idea as to who would be receptive to the legislation and who might need a little coaxing. We started walking/wheeling the blue back around the legislator to get sign-ons for co-sponsors. We were amazed how many legislators were not aware of the practice of paying people with disabilities sub-minimum wage. After we met with legislators and explained what the bill would do, we had a lot of co-sponsors.
How did the bill change from the original proposal that you and the advocates had put in the beginning to the time that it was actually made into a law?
The first draft of the phase-out time was 3 years. Early on, coalition members discussed how long the phase-out time should, and we negotiated to 4 years. There was a lot of compromises done with the legislation before the final version was completed.
Tell me a little bit about what's exactly in the final version of the law.
It prohibits new 14C certificates from being authorized to any organizations that don't currently hold a certificate. Those that do currently hold 14C certificates will be able to extend them until 2020. Creates a set of benchmarks and desired outcomes for each year of the phase-out to ensure people with disabilities are given the opportunity for employment in the community and of their choosing.
We found the same thing was true, Ken, with the strategic plan as well, that it takes a lot of people to be on board, and some people may not support it in the beginning, but as we go along. So we were very, very thoughtful in Maryland. It takes a great, great vision, and Deputy Secretary Simons had a real vision for employment first, and we took that vision and brought together a large group of stakeholders and continued to engage people and to do community talks and to meet with providers, meet with families, and continue to work with everybody around making sure that there's an opportunity for voices to be heard. And it takes everybody together just to make something happen. And so I think that the journey of the Equal Employment Act and the journey of the strategic plan were very much the same. Ken, I understand that you have some experience with 14C, which is what drives your passion about this very issue. Can you talk a little bit about your own personal experience?
after I graduated from high school in 1983. I attended Johns Hopkins Computer Training School, completed the coursework, and set my sights on getting a job in the computer field. To my surprise, after vocational rehabilitation services couldn't get me a job, they sent me to a sheltered workshop. Do you know how demeaning it was going to a sheltered workshop after completing a difficult programming class?
That must have been really surprising to both you and your parents and your family that opportunity for you to use what you'd learned didn't really happen.
Yes, so I went one day and saw what it was all about and never went back. But what if I did go back and work there? I probably would have still been there working for pennies on the dollar, not having the opportunities I have today, not having money to buy a van, not having the money to buy my own house.
Today, the studies show that it takes a person an average of 36 years to leave a sheltered workshop once they've started working there. So we're glad, for our sake, that you aren't working in a sheltered, didn't start your career in a sheltered workshop. So tell me a little bit about what you do now.
Now I coordinate the advocacy and public policy initiatives for People on the Go of Maryland. I represent People on the Go on the Developmental Disabilities Coalition. I have the honor to sit on the United States President's Committee for Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. I also sit on the Community Advisory Council for the Maryland Center for Developmental Disabilities and the MD Employment First State Leadership Team, as well as various other state and local committees. I am well versed in community living and the importance of directing your own services. I have also completed the Partners in Policymaking program, served as a legislative intern with the Maryland Senate, and worked as an Ask Me interviewer for the ARC of Maryland and Developmental Disabilities Administration after studying computer programming at Johns Hopkins University.
Great, great. So not everybody probably wanted this law to pass. Can you talk a little bit about who the opposition was and some of the strategies?
Some organizations and some family members are opposed to abolishing the minimum wage because they believe that some people with disabilities are less productive than those without disabilities. Some people without disabilities are less productive than their counterparts, but that doesn't mean we pay them sub-minimum wage. We also added a plan in the legislation that will address barriers for people who would like to be employed. Karen, will you talk about that?
Thanks, Ken. I think that's really where we see the strategic plan and the law coming together, is you have to be able to get rid of barriers, but to get rid of barriers, you need to build capacity in a system. And so a large part of this bill will address for each individual person on their annual planning process what it is exactly that has been their barrier to the employment. Is it that the person doesn't know what they're good at? Is it that they live far out in the country and so transportation is an issue? And then not only do we address the barriers, but the plan should really talk about how it is that we're going to overcome that barrier. So I think that's a really critical part of the bill, and I think it really melds nicely with the Employment First strategic plan. Well, Ken has shared information about the Equal Employment Act. I'd like to share some other information happening in Maryland at the same time as the strategic planning process was happening. Maryland is looking at an entire transformation, looking at rates, rate development, looking at the individual planning process, moving towards a person-centered planning and thinking process. So as a part of the bigger transitions that were happening in Maryland, we were able to access some technical assistance and training from subject matter experts. We have a grant from the Department of Labor Employment First State Leadership Mentoring Program, as well as subject matter experts helping us from the Support supported employment leadership network. And with all of those resources coming into Maryland, we've been able to tap some talent around the country to help us to implement Employment First and build that capacity. So I see it really as a two-step process. We have the capacity building side, but we also have the systems change side, and they're happening at the same time. And certainly the Equal Employment Act was critical in not only the initial component of making this happen, but also to make sure that it doesn't go away. As it's now in legislation, it's something that will hold DDA and providers and families in Maryland accountable to increasing competitive integrated employment for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Now it's my turn to ask you a question. Who are the state partners to ensure this legislation get implemented?
Well, Ken, as you know, in the bill, the state is required to put together a plan and to report back to the legislature the progress. And the Maryland Department of Disabilities, with Secretary Beatty, as well as the Developmental Disabilities Administration, will lead the team of state partners, which include the Department of Commerce, Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, or DOORS, and the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council. It's really the vision of Deputy Secretary Bernie Simons, who has kept Employment First on the front burner, as well as all of the other changes that need to happen. And his vision to keep us moving along towards a person-centered planning and thinking state is really commendable, and it's been the catalyst for all of this to happen. So Ken, what role do you see the legislation playing in the larger part of Employment First?
On a bigger scale, the Maryland, under Deputy Secretary Simmons' leadership, is looking at creating an infrastructure to support not only these services, but all supports and services in the wheelhouse. To move the system closer to a person-centered planning and thinking, Maryland is reviewing the rate structure, creating a new process for person-centered planning and a more flexible and able data entry system, as well as amending their home and community-based waiver. All of these changes will position Maryland to implement the Equal Employment Act and Employment First strategic plan.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining Ken and I today as we talk a little bit about Maryland moving into an Employment First state, implementing the strategic plan and the implementation of the Ken Capone Equal Employment Act. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ken, for joining me.
Again, my name is Ken Capone. Thank you.